Pete Best truly hated him more than anyone. Pete Best was born Randolph Peter Best on November 24, 1941 in Madras, British India, where his father worked as a marine engineer during World War II. His mother, Mona Best, was a determined and lively woman who would later play a huge role in the early days of the Beatles. When the war ended, the Best family moved to Liverpool, England, where Mona opened the Casbah Coffee Club in the basement of their home on Hayman's Green. This small place would become a really important starting point for many young musicians of the late 1950s and early 1960s, including a group of local teenagers who would soon change music history forever. Pete grew up surrounded by rhythm, big dreams, and the energy of post-war Liverpool, a city that buzzed with the beat of early rock and roll. Pete's love for music grew naturally in this creative atmosphere. While going to collegiate grammar school, he started showing a talent for drums, often playing around with homemade drum kits. His quiet, moody personality was very different from the more showy personalities around him, yet his determination and cool attitude made him stand out. In 1959, when local teenagers John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison were forming a group called the Quarrymen, they often played at the Casbah Club. When they later decided to become a full-time rock and roll band, renaming themselves the Silver Beatles and eventually the Beatles, they found themselves in need of a steady drummer. Pete Best was the obvious choice. In August 1960, Pete officially joined the Beatles, completing the lineup that would go on the band's first tough performance trip to Hamburg, Germany. The Beatles' time in Hamburg became legendary, weeks of all-night performances that shaped their style, energy, and musical chemistry. Pete's powerful drumming helped drive the band's sound during these early days. Fans and club owners in Hamburg were captivated by his looks and rhythmic intensity. His thick dark hair and serious expression made him something of a heartthrob among female fans. Musically, he provided the raw beat that carried the Beatles through marathon sessions, earning him respect from his bandmates, at least for a while. However, by 1962, tensions began to rise. Producer George Martin, after listening to the band, reportedly said he wasn't happy with Pete's drumming and suggested using a session drummer for recordings. This, coupled with personal problems within the group, led to one of the most infamous decisions in music history. On August 16, 1962, Pete was called into manager Brian Epstein's office and was told that he was being replaced by another drummer, Ringo Starr. The firing crushed Pete. He had been with the band through their toughest early years, helping them improve their stage act and earn their first major opportunities. Yet just as they were on the edge of worldwide fame, he was left behind. In the aftermath, Pete Best went through years of deep emotional struggle. For a time, he avoided public appearances, suffering from depression and disappointment. However, he gradually rebuilt his life with quiet dignity. He formed other bands, including the Pete Best Band, and later stepped away from music entirely, working for the civil service for many years. Unlike some who might have been eaten up by bitterness, Pete handled his fate with remarkable grace. He married Kathy, with whom he raised 2 daughters and kept a relatively private life in Liverpool. Over time, the shame of being the man who was almost a Beatle evolved into a badge of respect. Fans began to see Pete not as a forgotten figure, but as a vital part of the Beatles' foundation. The Beatles anthology, which was released in 1995, became a huge moment not only in the history of music, but also in the life of Pete Best. For over 3 decades, Best had lived in the shadow of the Beatles' extraordinary fame, having been kicked out of the band just before they achieved worldwide success. The anthology project, which included a television documentary, a series of albums, and a detailed book, looked back at the band's earliest days and featured some of their original recordings made before Ringo Starr joined. Among these were early demo tracks recorded at Abbey Road Studios and at Decca Records with Pete Best on drums. When these recordings were officially released as part of the Beatles Anthology 1, Best was legally entitled to royalties because his performances were included. For the first time since his departure in 1962, he received significant financial payment for his contributions to the band's early years. This moment was deeply symbolic. Not only did it provide Best with overdue recognition for his role in shaping the early Beatles sound, but it also represented a measure of closure and payback after years of being shown as the man who had missed out on history. Fans around the world celebrated this turn of events, viewing it as justice for a musician who had lived through decades of being ignored and talked about. Best himself later admitted that the royalties brought him both financial comfort and emotional satisfaction as they proved that his place in Beatles history was genuine and impossible to erase. In 2008, Pete Best stepped further into the spotlight with the release of his own album, Hayman's Green, which got surprising critical approval. The record, credited to the Pete Best Band, showed a collection of rock songs that mixed a modern sound with echoes of 1960s influences, a clear nod to the time period in which Best first made his mark. The album's title paid tribute to Hayman's Green, the Liverpool area where the Casbah Coffee Club had once stood, the very venue founded by his mother, Mona Best, and the birthplace of the Beatles' earliest performances. The project was a family affair featuring his younger brother, Rogue Best, on drums and co-production duties. Critics noted that Hayman's Green showed not only Pete's musical maturity, but also his thoughtful outlook on the long and winding path his life had taken since leaving the Beatles. Songs like Come With Me and Dream Me Home showed emotional depth and skill, proving that Pete Best was more than just the man before Ringo. The album allowed him to reclaim his identity as an artist on his own terms, independent of the Beatles' legacy, yet forever connected to it. Pete Best's romantic journey with Kathy began in 1962 during one of the most exciting and life-changing times of his life. It was at a Beatles party held at the legendary Cavern Club in Liverpool, a smoky, pulsing underground venue that had become the heart of the Muri beat scene where fate brought them together. The cavern was packed with energy that night, alive with the rhythm of rock and roll and the laughter of young dreamers who had no idea how much history was being made around them. Amid the chaos of flashing lights, swaying bodies, and the hypnotic beat of the music, Pete noticed a young woman whose joyful spirit and natural grace stood out to him. Kathy, who worked as a staff member at the local Woolworth store, was dancing freely and happily, completely absorbed in the moment. Pete, still dealing with his own recent departure from the Beatles and going through a wave of emotions, found himself drawn to her warmth and real smile. As the evening went on, Pete couldn't take his eyes off her. There was something honest and calming about Kathy, a contrast to the craziness of fame and the uncertainty that surrounded his career at that time. Gathering his courage, he walked up to her, and the two began to talk among the music and laughter. Their conversation flowed easily, filled with shared humor, curiosity, and the spark of instant connection. Pete later remembered that it wasn't just her beauty that drew him in, but her kindness and natural way, qualities that made him feel seen as the man behind the fame, not just as the former Beatles drummer. For Pete, who had lived through the heartbreak of being kicked out from the band he helped form, Kathy represented comfort, understanding, and a fresh start. Their relationship grew quickly, built on mutual respect and real affection rather than the flash of celebrity. Kathy was supportive and down-to-earth, grounding Pete as he began rebuilding his life and musical career. She stood by him through moments of reflection and reinvention, helping him regain confidence and purpose after the whirlwind of the Beatles' early years. In 1963, a year after they first met, Pete and Kathy married in a modest but heartfelt ceremony that showed their shared values, love, family, and strength over glamour and publicity. The couple's bond proved lasting, a testament to their deep emotional connection and shared determination to live a meaningful life beyond the spotlight. Together, Pete and Kathy built a home rooted in love and stability. Their marriage would be blessed with 2 daughters, both of whom became central to Pete's world. Family life gave him a sense of belonging and peace that fame had never offered. Pete often gave credit to Kathy for being his anchor, the person who helped him find happiness after one of the most public professional setbacks in music history. While others might have been eaten up by bitterness or nostalgia, Pete chose to look forward, dedicating himself to his family and music on his own terms. Kathy's quiet strength and unwavering loyalty were crucial in helping him maintain that positive outlook. When people talk about the early days of the Beatles, there is often a warm sense of friendship. 4 young men from Liverpool chasing a dream that would change music history. But behind that shining legend was a storm of personal tension, hurt egos, and painful betrayal. And for Pete Best, the band's original drummer, the deepest wound of all came not from fame slipping through his fingers, but from the man he felt most wronged by, Paul McCartney. Best never hid his feelings about McCartney, and over the years, he spoke with an honesty that showed just how deeply that bitterness ran. In interviews, Pete Best was often asked about his relationship with the other Beatles, particularly with John Lennon, George Harrison, and Paul McCartney. His tone would noticeably change when Paul's name came up. Out of all of them, Pete once said, "Paul was the one I had the hardest time forgiving." That statement alone carried decades of anger. Anger born from what Best saw as McCartney's quiet ambition and calculating nature hidden beneath his polite smile. Pete explained that during their early days, he and Paul were never truly close. "We were never mates the way John and I were." He admitted Paul was friendly enough, but there was always something about him, a sort of distance, like he was sizing everyone up. Pete Best had joined the Beatles in 1960 when they were still just another struggling band from Liverpool trying to make a name for themselves in the smoky clubs of Hamburg. He was the one who gave them a solid beat, the one who helped them get their first steady gigs. Fans loved him for his moody good looks, and he became something of a local heartthrob, something Paul McCartney, according to Pete, did not appreciate. "I could feel it," Pete said. "Paul didn't like that some of the girls in the audience were looking at me instead of him. It sounds silly now, but when you're young, jealousy can eat away at friendships." There were also musical differences between them. McCartney was a perfectionist, obsessed with getting everything right in harmony, while Pete had a rougher, more natural style that fit the raw energy of their early performances. Paul wanted everything polished, Pete recalled, but the Beatles back then weren't about polish. "We were about power." He used to criticize my drumming quietly behind my back rather than just telling me what he thought. I found out later that he was one of the ones pushing George Martin to replace me. That discovery that McCartney had played a role in his dismissal was something Pete never fully forgave. When Pete Best was suddenly fired from the Beatles in August 1962, just before they recorded their first single for Emmy, he was crushed. "It wasn't just losing the band," he said years later. "It was losing the brothers I thought I had." And Paul, out of all of them, felt like the one who really wanted me gone. The official story from manager Brian Epstein was unclear. That George Martin didn't think Pete's drumming was strong enough, but over time, stories came out suggesting that personal conflicts within the band had played just as big a role. Pete always believed Paul was at the center of that conflict. Paul was ambitious, maybe the most ambitious of all of us. He had this vision of the Beatles being perfect. And in his mind, I didn't fit that vision. After being replaced by Ringo Starr, Pete fell into a deep depression. He struggled to find work and even thought about giving up music entirely. Meanwhile, the Beatles shot to superstardom. Watching them on television after that was torture, Pete said. And when I saw Paul smiling and joking, it felt like a knife in the gut. He had everything I'd lost, fame, fortune, and the band I'd helped build. That bitterness grew for years. While he eventually found peace and built a quiet life for himself, Pete admitted that he could never forget how it ended. "Time heals a lot of things," he said in a later interview. "But not that. Paul and I were never friends. I doubt we ever could be." Despite the passing decades, Pete Best's words about McCartney remained remarkably consistent. Even when he praised John Lennon's creativity or George Harrison's kindness, he drew a firm line with Paul. John was wild. George was thoughtful, he once said. But Paul was the one who always had to be in control. That's who he was then, and that's who he still is. It wasn't pure hatred though, more a mix of pain and lingering mistrust. Pete admitted that he respected what McCartney achieved, but he could never separate that from what he lost. "I can't deny he's a genius," Pete said. "But geniuses can be ruthless, and Paul was ruthless with me." In the end, Pete Best's story and his feelings toward Paul McCartney became one of rock history's great emotional scars. The heartbreak of the man who almost had it all, and the anger toward the friend who, in his eyes, made sure he didn't.